Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are continuing our reading of Silas K. Hocking's Real Grit, which I have with me right here. We are now at chapter 10 in our story, and when last we left Jack Formby and Ada Woodville, they were at a crossroads. The two had reconsidered their feelings for one another, and Ada had spoken to Jack about his ambition, and he had made a sort of deal with her that in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years he would come back to her, having made something of himself as a man and making himself worthy of her noble affections, something to which she found herself delighted. And so they have parted for now, hoping to return and reunite soon, once that grand destiny has been achieved. But let us see what happens next in the story. I fear it will not be a straight and simple road. So here we are, with chapter 10 of Real Grit, Clouds and Darkness. When Jack reached his home, he found the household in a state of consternation. The servants were gliding hither and thither with white, scared faces and perfectly noiseless footsteps, while no one seemed capable of speaking except in the faintest and most mysterious whisper. "Well, I wonder what's up now," he said to himself as he passed out of the side door and came face to face with the gardener. "Oh, Blake," he said, "what's gone wrong with the maids, for they seem to have taken permanent leave of their senses?" "Why, don't you know, Mr. John?" said Blake, staring at him in surprise. "Haven't you heard what's happened?" "I've heard nothing," said Jack. "Have they quarrelled, or lost something, or broken something, or killed somebody? What is it?" "Oh, 'tis nothing about the girls at all," said Blake. "It's about the master. Don't you know?" "I tell you, I know nothing," said Jack impatiently. "Has he dismissed them in a lot? Come, out with it, man." "Oh, no, it's worse than that," said Blake, brushing his hand across his eyes. "The master fell down sudden in his office, just about lunchtime." "Fell down in his office?" said Jack in a bewildered tone. "What do you mean?" "He were took with a kind of fit or something, after hearing some bad news," said Blake mysteriously, "and when they lifted him up, it were all over with him." "All over with him?" gasped Jack. "Do you mean that my father is dead?" "Yes, sir. That's the news that's been brought down," Blake answered. "But I thought you knew, sir, all about it." But Jack did not wait to reply or to hear anything further. Rushing to the station at a headlong speed, he was luckily just in time to catch a fast train to Bodelford. Yet such was his impatience that it seemed to him as though the train would never reach its destination. He could not sit still. Up and down the empty compartment he walked with quick and agitated steps during all the journey. And when, at length, he reached the huge, busy terminus, he sprang out on the platform before the train stopped and jumped into a hansom. He was driven away swiftly to his farther office. At the door he was met by the head clerk. Is it true? My father dead? He gasped, not waiting for the clerk to speak. Yes, Mr. John, it is too true, was the answer, and the clerk turned his head to hide the moisture that had gathered in his eyes. For a moment Jack did not speak or move. Then, by a great effort, he said, "Where is he?" "In his own private office, sir," was the answer. "Would you like to see him, sir?" And with a slight inclination of the head, Jack followed the faithful old servant to where his father lay. He might have been asleep, so easy and comfortable was the posture in which he lay on the large feather-covered lounge. There was no sign of any death struggle. He had not fallen down as had been reported. He lay down, a strange thing for him to do, and when found, he was quite dead, his head resting on his hand, his face calm and peaceful, his eyes closed. And in fact, there is another woodcut print here of that very scene, as Jack finds his father lying in his study. When last seen alive, he was in a state of great agitation, for he had received tidings of another fall in cotton, a pleasant bit of news to many people, but to him it meant bankruptcy and ruin. For months he had felt as though he were walking on the edge of a precipice. For months he had kept hoping, though the markets had steadily gone against him. But now, all that he dreaded most had happened, and he was penniless. The shock, the ruin, and the disgrace were more than he could bear. The troubled and weary spirit quietly slipped its cable and drifted out to the great unknown. There were whispers of poison, a small phial found under the cushion, of hints he had dropped of what might be expected should the disaster he had expected overtake him, but nothing came of them. Failure of the heart's action was the doctor's sententious reply, and the jury returned a verdict of death from natural causes. The funeral was a very quiet one. There was nothing wasted in pomp or display. Alas, there was nothing to waste. Jack returned after the funeral to the home that was no longer his, and spent the afternoon in packing his portmanteau. Tomorrow he would have to go forth alone, to fight for himself the battle of life. He had mourned for his father until he had no more tears to weep, and now, with resolute will, he was bracing himself for the struggle that lay before him. When he had finished his packing, he locked himself in his den, and gave himself up to reflection. A bright fire was burning in the grate, for the evening was chilly, and his large, easy smoking chair was drawn up almost close to the fender. What a cosy room it was! How bright and cheerful! How full of every comfort and luxury! Here he had spent some of the happiest hours he had known, albeit hours of idleness and sloth. Here, with his feet on the fender, and his eyes fixed on the fire, he had dreamed his dreams, and built his castles in the air. Alas, they had all vanished now, and he was thrown upon a world helpless and alone. He had not a relative on earth that he knew, save Ralph Formby. There had been an Uncle Jack once, after whom he had been named, the only brother his father ever had, but he had not been heard of for 15 years. He was in Australia then, trying his fortune at the diggings, and not succeeding very well. Since then, no message had ever reached England concerning him, and his brother Robert had long since given him up as dead. Practically, therefore, Jack felt himself alone in the world and penniless. Ralph could not help him, for he had enough to do himself to make both ends meet. Indeed, how he lived at all was to Jack a mystery. Moreover, he would not like to be dependent upon Ralph in any way if he could help it. Somehow, he hardly knew how, he had no faith in him. He was too humble, and yet at the same time paraded his philanthropy too much to please Jack. No, he muttered, staring into the fire. I must fight my way alone. But the odds are frightfully against me. I do not stand the chance even of an ordinary clodhopper, for I've never been trained for work. Would that I had never been born. Then, clasping his hands tightly together, he murmured, "Oh, Father, Father, that it should have come to this, that you should have toiled and struggled and schemed to heap up a fortune for me, and that it should have ended thus. If you had but taught me self-reliance, if you had instructed me how to earn my own bread, how much better it would have been. But there, I will not complain. You did it for the best, and no lad ever had a better father than I." Then his last conversation with Ada came back to him. "You will not fail," she had said, "if you trust in God." Would God help him, he wondered? Help him to bear his grief in patience and his lot without repining? Would God help him in his struggle with the world and keep him from utter despair? He had never given any thought to religion, had never cared to go to church or chapel. He had tried to be honest and virtuous and truthful, because in his soul he abhorred vice and falsehood. But he had never prayed since he was a child, and rarely thought of God. But he was alone now, helpless and forsaken, without a friend in the universe, except God was his friend, and of that he was by no means sure. Ada seemed to have no doubt about the matter, but then women's faith was always stronger in such matters than that of men, and Ada might be mistaken. Yet all the while his heart was aching for comfort and help, and to whom he could go but to God. It seemed easy enough, when he had not a care in the world, to forget God, but all that was changed now. He was like a bird in a storm, driven to the only refuge that was near. So at length he fell upon his knees and buried his face in his hands and began to pray. "O Lord God," he said, "I am alone in the world and broken-hearted, and I don't know what to do, nor which way to turn. Wilt thou help me? My heart is heavy. Wilt thou comfort me? My way is dark. Wilt thou guide me? I want to do right and earn my bread honestly. If thou wilt help me, I will be very thankful. Amen." He remained on his knees some little time after the prayer was said, crying softly to himself, the first tears he had shed for the day. That little prayer had subdued him in a way he could not understand, and the hard feeling that had been in his heart all the day was now entirely gone, and when he rose from his knees there was a light upon his face that was altogether now new. "I feel better, anyhow," he said to himself with a smile. "I think God will help me, after all." For another hour he sat, quite still, watching the faces in the fire. How they came and went. Only 2 faces seemed to linger and look at him with kindly eyes. His father's and Ada's. The one he should see no more on earth except in dreams. The other, perhaps, was lost to him also. He had not seen her since that morning he had met her on the fringe of the moors, and had parted with the touch of her lips warm upon his own. A brief note of condolence he carried in his pocket, in which she expressed her sympathy for him in his sorrow, and prayed that God would help him and make him strong. Could he hope to win her now? He had been her equal in station when he had told her of his love and pleaded for a word of hope. But now he was penniless, and the son of a bankrupt. He had neither home or position to offer her. Both he must make ere he could dare to speak to her of love again. Should he give up in despair? God helping him, he never would. Life was before him, and he would fight its battle as long as he had strength to lift a finger. He had heard of circumstances making men, developing their latent talents, calling into play their dormant faculties, and rousing all the manhood that was in their nature. Might it not be so in his case? Perhaps this calamity that had come upon him might prove a blessing in disguise. He had lived a worthless life hitherto, doing nothing and cared for nothing. In this respect his wealth had been a curse to him. But all this was changed now, and he must work or starve. And if Ada saw him working and succeeding, he believed that she would wait for him, and encourage him with her smile, and with helpful, hopeful words. And out of the fire her sweet, pure face seemed to beam upon him, and in his heart the memory of her words still lingered. If you trust in him, I am sure you will not fail. No, I will not fail, he said, rising to his feet and clenching his fists. If there is any grit in me, now is the time to let it be seen, and if there is any faith in me, now is the time to exercise it. And surely manhood is better than money, and faith is better than fortune. Ada thinks so at least, and for her sake and my own I will play the man. And now farewell to ease and luxury and pampered idleness and sloth. The bugle calls to battle, and I will go forth and conquest or to death. For death is better than failure, and oblivion better than disgrace. One more night in the dear old home that has sheltered me so long, and then... Tomorrow morning I go forth like one of old, not knowing whither I go. But God will guide me if I trust in him, and in the great, toiling city of Bodilford I shall surely find something to do. My father was respected to the last, and it cannot be that his son will be given no chance. I know his creditors must suffer loss, but nothing shall be kept back. Nothing! I would rather starve than keep anything that does not belong to me. And if I fail in Bodilford, then I must try else. But he did not finish the sentence. A sudden knock came to the door, and on unlocking it he found himself face to face with his cousin Ralph.
"Oh, Jack," was the pleasant greeting. "I'm glad to see you looking so cheerful. I'm very sorry I was compelled to leave you so long alone."
"Oh, thank you," Jack answered hastily.
"I have not suffered on that account, let me assure you.
I have packed my things and put all my little affairs in order, and am now ready to face the world, and I trust to do my duty."
"And have you settled on any plan of action?" Ralph asked, eyeing him narrowly.
"Nothing, except this, that tomorrow morning I go to Bodleford, seeking employment. I hope to get apartments for a few shillings a week, and I trust I shall be able to get some employment that will keep me, at least, from starvation."
"I'm glad you look at the matter in the sensible light you do. I know it must be awfully hard upon a fellow brought up as you have been, to have to face the world in this way. I think, however, if I were in your place, I should try my fortune in one of the colonies, or in the States."
"Not yet," said Jack quickly. "There are special reasons why I desire to remain in England, and I shall not think of the colonies until I fail here."
"As you think best, my dear fellow," said Ralph complacently. "And now I want you to look upon me as your friend. I am older than you, and have had, I may say, to rough it all my life. So I know all the ropes, so to speak, and I may be of real service to you if you will let me. I know you have not much cared for me in the past, but let that go. I hope now you may see that, in heart and in intention at least, I am a true friend to you."
"I'm sure you're very kind," said Jack, moving uneasily in his chair, "and if you can assist me in any way in earning an honest living, I shall be only too grateful."
"That's just what I can do," said Ralph with a smile. "I know, for instance, that Brown, Toadsby, and Company of Swindle Street have a stool vacant in their office at the present time, and a word from me would secure you the vacant post, if that's anything in your line."
"I should be only too thankful to get it," said Jack, in tones of real emotion. "You know I have absolutely nothing now but what I earn."
"Yes, I know," said Ralph, "and no one grieves more for you than I do. Indeed, I am the only near relative you have alive, I believe, unless your Uncle Jack be living, which I do not think is very likely. So that there is no one left to take an interest in you but me."
"Perhaps so," said Jack dubiously. "A time like this puts one's friends to the test."
"It does indeed, my dear fellow," said Ralph pompously. "And after this you will know who your real friends are, and who are friends in name only."
Jack winced a little at this. Ralph was too fussy and obtrusive to be an altogether pleasant guest. But then it was his way, and Jack felt that he could not afford to be sensitive in these times. "I will call at your office, then, tomorrow morning," he remarked at length, "and you will perhaps go with me to Brown Toadsby's?"
"With pleasure," said Ralph, "with pleasure. And now, good night, or I shall be late for my train."
Jack went with him to the outer door, and locked it behind him, and then returned again to his den, and gave himself up to reflection once more. The visit of his cousin was not an altogether satisfactory one. He had talked about grief and sympathy, and neither in look or tone had he exhibited either. On the contrary, Jack had almost felt that he was secretly rejoicing at the turn affairs had taken. No, he said to himself at length. "I'm wronging Jack by cherishing such thoughts. Everyone else has forsaken me. He alone has shown his friendship in a practical fashion, and I ought not to question his motives. And what is more, I won't if I can help it.
And now for bed and sleep, if it will come. God help thee, for my heart is very sore. Chapter 11. A Changeful Lot. It would be difficult to describe the firm of Brown, Toadsby and Company. They described themselves as brokers and commission agents, and the title served as well as any other would have done, besides which it sounded well, which was no small matter. But it gave little or no idea of the business done, or of the character of the firm. In fact, all was fish that came to Brown and Toadsby's net, and no transaction was too mean if money could be made out of it. Jack had never heard of Brown and Toadsby until his conversation with Ralph, described in the last chapter, nor was he aware until years after that the company was none other than Ralph himself. Mr. Brown was a stout, elderly gentleman, somewhat greasy in appearance, and remarkably oily in manner. His eyes were small and watery, his forehead low and retreating, his hair straight and abundant. He had an uneasy, restless manner, and a habit of constantly looking about him when speaking to anyone. His voice was low and insinuating, while he garnished his conversation with frequent passages of Scripture. It felt as though he had a remarkable gift in extempore prayer, and a religious experience that was wonderfully rich and unctuous. He was great at tea meetings, though he was never distinguished for liberality. Many people liked to see their names figuring on subscription lists. Mr. Brown was not so vain. "Let not your left hand know what your right hand doeth," was his motto, and he lived up to it to the best of his ability. Some uncharitable people said that if Mr. Brown's left hand knew what the right hand did, it would blush with shame. But then, there are uncharitable people everywhere. Mr. Toadsby, unlike his partner, was slim and rather tall, with a bald head, a clean-shaven face, and a pointed chin. His lips had fallen in by reason of the absence of teeth, and the habitual expression of his face was one of deep sadness. He was considerably younger than Mr. Brown, though he looked years older. He was considered a very shrewd man of business, quick, silent, and always on the alert. He had not the suave manner that Mr. Brown had, and never wasted words under any circumstances. But nothing escaped his keen grey eye, while he knew, as if by instinct, the character of the people with whom he had to deal. Mr. Brown and Mr. Toadsby had nothing in common except an insatiable craving after money. Brown was a Whig, Toadsby was a Tory. Brown was professedly a religious man. Toadsby spent his Sabbaths in balancing his accounts. Brown sometimes talked about his conscience. Toadsby had never been troubled by any such possession. Brown had been married 4 times. Toadsby had never been married at all. Yet for all this, they agreed perfectly. Brown sometimes winced at some of Toadsby's transactions, but they generally turned out so profitable that he hadn't the heart to complain, while, as the years passed on, his conscience became elastic enough for anything. Jack was introduced by his cousin Ralph to Mr. Brown, who received him very graciously, not to say unctuously, and began talking in his brisk, oily manner, as though all he had to say had been carefully prepared beforehand. "I knew your father well, Mr. Formby, and a worthy man he was.
overreached himself, it's true, as the best men are apt to do. But as the apostle says, they that will be rich fall into a snare. Not that your father was a grasping, mean man by any means. No, but mistakes will happen. I feel very sorry for you. It must be a great trouble, I'm sure. But then, we are born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. So the good book tells us, you know. However, you're young, and have the world before you, as we say, and if I can give you a lift by the way, I shall be only too happy.
Thank you very much, I'm sure, said Jack, while Mr. Brown paused to recover his breath.
Oh, don't mention it, Mr. Brown went on. We are commanded to bear one another's burdens, you know, and then, in your case, you will give us quid pro quo, as we say. The salary will be small, £60 per annum for a start, if that will suit you, Mr. Formby. Say so, and the thing can be settled at once.
So it came about that Jack was installed in Brown/Toadsby's office. He was not altogether pleased with the appointment.
He felt, somehow, as though his fate had been arranged for him, as though he were the subject of a conspiracy. He tried his best, however, to put away the thought as unworthy of him. Both his cousin Ralph and Mr. Brown had been true friends to him. He was quite aware that for a start he was not worth £60 a year. He knew absolutely nothing about business, and had everything to learn. Yet in spite of this, Mr. Brown, who could easily have got a much more capable man, had taken him on. And Jack tried to be thankful, and did his best to do his duty. He was determined that if hard work and attention to duty would win a position in the world, he would not fail. So he stuck to his desk from morning till night, and did, to the very best of his ability, everything that his employers put into his hands. No fault could they possibly find with him. He might be slow, but he was careful and sure, and quite willing to work an hour or two overtime to make up for any deficiency in the matter of quickness. So the days dragged slowly along and lengthened into weeks. To Jack they seemed like years, so leaden-footed was their march. They were brightened, however, by a great purpose and a great hope. Every day he was gaining experience and schooling himself to business habits, and though the future was still dark and uncertain, he was not without hope that he would be able to do what others had done before him. How it was to be accomplished he could not see. From Brown and Toadsby's office he could see no Jacob's ladder reaching up to the heaven of his hopes and dreams. Still, a way might be there, though hidden from his sight. God might be leading him, though he could not see his hand. This much, at least, was clear. He must do his duty, and watch, and wait. He had taken very humble apartments in a poor, though respectable street. His little sitting-room he called his den, in memory of other days. Here he spent his evenings alone, trying to nerve himself for the great battle that lay before him. He was wonderfully cheerful on the whole, and found his chief solace in books. Cigars and pipes he had put aside as being a much too expensive luxury with his present income. For the same reason he gave up all intoxicating drinks.
"Whatever good there may be in beer and tobacco," he said, "I don't think they will help me in the present juncture."
So he resolutely put his foot down on every wasteful habit, and was surprised to find, after a while, that he was none the worse for the sacrifice. That he should indulge in dreams of the past now and then is not to be wondered at. yet he never moped or spent his time in useless repining. He had never been happy in the old days, except when dreaming of Ada Woodville or rambling with her on the hillsides, and though there were many little luxuries he sadly missed, on the whole he was fairly content with his lot. There was some compensation in knowing that he was doing his best, and that he was no longer eating the bread of idleness. And though he cordially disliked both Mr. Brown and Mr. Toadsby, and felt very dubious occasionally about the character of some of their transactions, yet he was preparing himself for something better, should ever the opportunity offer. So the days dragged on without change or excitement, and, but for the weekly recurring Sabbath, the monotony would have been almost unbearable. Each Sunday morning, if the weather was fine, he made straight for the country, taking his lunch in his pocket. Generally he dropped into some village church or chapel during the service hour, and felt refreshed in body and mind for the rest and change, and then he would start on the tramp again, working his way back to Bodelford in time for tea. He never went near his old home. He felt he could not bear the sight of it yet. Nor did he make the least attempt to get a glimpse of Ada Woodville, though his heart was hungering with a terrible pain for a sight of her face. Since the day of his father's death, he had never seen her, and excepting her brief note of condolence, no word had passed between them. Yet she was in his thoughts nearly every hour of the day, and the memory of her smile and of her kind, hopeful words was a constant source of inspiration to him. Of course, she would know what he was doing, for Ralph still visited Netherby Hall, and would be sure to tell them how he was getting on. What did Ada think of him now, he wondered. If he had been at Netherby Hall at that moment, he would have got an answer to his question, for the Ralph and the Netherbys were in very earnest conversation about no less a person than Jack himself.
"I think he's trying to do his best," Ralph said, "but I fear that he'll never make anything out of it. He's never been trained to business habits, and, worse still, he has acquired many expensive habits. And in a city like Bodelford, there are so many temptations placed in the way of young men, and Jack is easily persuaded."
"But I have heard he is working very hard," Dick said, "and really shaping well."
Ralph smiled superciliously before he answered, and softly stroked his dark moustache, all of which was not lost upon his auditors. "He has to work pretty hard at Brown Toadsby's. They are keen men of business, you know, and really, I hope he'll do well, but he will have a difficulty in making both ends meet at his present rate of living."
"I believe Mr. Formby will live well within his income, whatever it may be," Ada interposed, "for I am sure he is as honest as the day."
"I'm sure no one doubts his honesty for an instant," Ralph said with haste. "My fear is lest the very generosity of his nature may lead him into difficulty."
"I have no fear on that score at all," Ada answered with rising colour. "He will do what is right, whatever happens, and the way he has taken up his changed lot without a murmur or a word of repining is very noble of him." "Why, Ada, you are waxing quite eloquent," said Kate, in her usual half-pleasant, half-spiteful fashion. At which Ralph interposed quite gallantly, and said, "Miss Ada is quite right. Jack has buckled to work quite nobly, and whatever may be our fears, and they are the result of our great regard for him, we all sincerely hope that he will succeed." And then the conversation drifted away in other channels. It was very evident that Ralph was anxious to keep on good terms with Ada, and if he was jealous of Jack, he was very careful to keep his jealousy to himself. That he wanted to win Ada's affections, there could be no doubt, not as an object in itself, but as a means to an end, and that end, Ada's fortune. Hence he played his cards with great care, flattering her where he imagined flattery would please, and strongly and persistently advocating the principles which he knew were dear to her heart, while, at the same time, by cleverly veiled insinuations, he tried to throw doubt on Jack's ability, and even suggested, in an off-handed fashion, that trouble of a serious kind was in store for him, unless events took an unexpected turn. He did not say in so many words what he thought the trouble was likely to be, but from such fragments of conversation as expensive tastes and present rate of income, people formed their own conclusions, and some people went so far as to shake their heads in a very dubious kind of fashion when his name was mentioned. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, we hardly know which, Jack knew nothing of this, and so went steadily on with his work, never dreaming of ill, and more confident each day that in the end he would win the victory. That is the end of chapter 11, and thus the end of our time together today. I always knew that Ralph Formby would turn out to be no good. Those kinds of characters, especially in this sort of literature, are always pretty self-evident. Those ones who are too good to be true, or at least present themselves that way, often turn out to be bounders and scoundrels in the end. I hope that Jack finds a way to thwart whatever machinations Ralph has planned, but I suppose we'll have to see how that turns out. We really saw in this last reading the evidence of Silas Hocking's own profession as a Methodist preacher in his insistence on the importance of piety and the relationship between faith and success. It's not something that I had really picked up on in prior readings, but it's become very evident to me now, perhaps because I know a bit more about Silas Hocking and his background. I'll be interested to see what else he has peppered into the story, but I am still very much enjoying it. I love the way that the passages flow, and I hope that all of you are enjoying the way that the story flows as well. And so, I will leave you here until next time, where I hope you will join me for chapter 12 of Real Grit on Soft Stories. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.